We have ignition, and we have liftoff of the Titan Centaur carrying the first of two Voyager spacecraft to extend man's senses farther into the solar system than ever before.
They were launched in 1977. That's a long time ago. We say 41 years, but it's really two generations ago. You can think of what the technology was. Your smartphone has 200,000 times more memory than what the Voyager spacecraft have. And so it's just exciting that we've been able to get it into interstellar space.
We launched two Voyager spacecraft. They were basically the same, but they were on different paths. Voyager 2 was the one that was chosen to do the grand tour. That is to fly by Jupiter, and then Saturn, and then Uranus, and then Neptune. And then after 1989, we began what is now called the Voyager interstellar mission. We were on a path we hoped to get to reach interstellar space while we still had power on the spacecraft to transmit the data back. And that's what Voyager 1 did in 2012, and that's now what Voyager 2 is starting to do in 2018. The sun creates this huge bubble of plasma, ionized material, goes outward at 1 million miles per hour and creates a bubble. And inside the bubble, most of the material has come from our sun, and the magnetic field has come from our sun. Outside the bubble, most of the material comes from other stars that exploded 5, 10, 15 million years ago. We have an instrument which measures the wind coming from the sun, and we saw that, in fact, there was no longer any measurable solar wind. We had left the bubble, basically.
The team has been looking forward for this for a long time and really working hard in an engineering sense to make this day happen and to keep the spacecraft with all the instruments on so that they could, all 5 instruments could sense the heliopause crossing and have data for that. What that means is that the Voyager 2 spacecraft is now traveling in interstellar space.
Well, this just contributes to the number of discoveries that Voyager's been making, and this is one we'd hoped we would have the chance to do, and fortunately, the SPOS spacecraft were still operating when they reached interstellar space. It's really quite remarkable. Voyager changed our view of the solar system, really. I mean, we saw these active volcanic activity on Io, we saw the possibility of ocean on Europa. Just time after time, we were discovering things that we had not really even imagined some years before the Voyager mission. What makes it so exciting is that not only do we confirm what we thought we knew, but even better, it tells us where we didn't know that there was something to be discovered.
going to talk about nutrition and the role it plays to keep astronauts healthy on the International Space Station. Hi, I'm NASA astronaut Tracy Dyson. Welcome to Station Life.
Houston on 2 for velocity confirmation. Assembly is 45 and 46. We're moving on to step 5.
You will go right now for that activity.
Copy, thank you.
Okay, Tracy, we copy, and that's good information. We'll pass it along.
Good nutrition is a part of good health, whether you're on Earth or off. Today's show will focus on nutrition research aboard the International Space Station. That's one small bite for man, one giant leaf for mankind. Astronauts Scott Kelly, Kjell Lindgren, and Kimya Yui of Japan recently sampled the fruits of their labor after growing and harvesting a crop of outrageous red romaine lettuce from the Veggie Plant Growth Facility. This was the first crop of vegetables grown in space, specifically for the purpose of providing fresh vegetables for the astronauts. Later this month, the crew will harvest zinnia flowers, a precursor for the next crop. We're going to try tomatoes. You know, living in space changes our bodies in a number of ways. We lose bone mineral density, our muscles atrophy, our cardiovascular system gets weaker, and we experience immune system dysfunction. One of the ways of understanding the changes in our bodies during long-duration spaceflight is to study our nutritional status at specific time points during our mission. Samples that we collect while we're in space provide scientists with information on bone metabolism, oxidative damage, body chemistry, and hormonal changes. These insights give scientists a more complete picture about what's happening in our bodies. That increased understanding of the role of nutrition in adaptation to spaceflight has a broader application on Earth. One example is understanding the relationship of nutrition to bone loss. This is potentially valuable for people suffering from osteoporosis right here on Earth.
The bones in our bodies are alive, growing, and changing all the time. Our bones are composed of different layers. The outer surface of bone is called cortical bone. This is the smooth, hard part of the bone that we can see when we look at a skeleton. Inside the cortical bone is the trabecular bone. This type of bone looks like a sponge and helps to protect the bone marrow. The constant process of bones growing and changing is known as bone remodeling. This process is carried out by specific cells in our bones. Cells called osteoclasts have the role of breaking down our bone and removing any parts that need replacing. At the same time, cells called osteoblasts have the job of making new bone and helping to repair any parts of the bone that have been damaged. On Earth, in healthy individuals, this process is normally balanced so that the same amount of bone is made and broken down. In space, astronauts are exposed to lower levels of gravity than on Earth. This means that they have less mechanical stress put on their bones as they move around. Scientists believe that the bones naturally try to adapt to this new environment by increasing the rate that the bone is broken down by the osteoclasts. Meanwhile, bone formation continues to occur at the same rate as it does on Earth. The result is an imbalance in bone remodeling, which leads to an overall decrease in bone mineral density. While in space, astronauts can manage with lower bone density, but when they return, their bones are less able to cope with Earth's gravity. This increases the risk of fracture and injury. Scientists use many different tests to measure the density of the astronauts' bones. Results show that the astronauts, while in space, lose bone in a similar pattern to people on Earth who suffer from osteoporosis, but the astronauts lose it at a much faster rate. Scientists have found that exercise, when combined with good nutrition and increased vitamin D intake, is able to preserve some of the bone that was previously being lost. Since 2008, astronauts have been able to use a new exercise machine called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or ARED. It is thought that this increase in force triggers the formation of new bone, bringing more balance to the bone remodeling process and allowing the bone density to stay at roughly the same level as it was before the spaceflight. It is a significant achievement to be able to maintain bone density in space, but more experiments need to be carried out to see whether the new bone which is formed in space has the same structure and strength as new bone which is formed on Earth. Understanding bone loss associated with microgravity may lead to better preventive care or therapeutic treatments for people on Earth suffering bone loss as a result of bone diseases like osteopenia and osteoporosis, or for patients on prolonged bed rest.
One of the things I love about the field of nutrition, one of the things that really drew me into the field of nutrition as a graduate student, was the fact that nutrition really is a cross-cutting science, and the fact that we get to look at all the systems and nutrition in and of itself. So doing bone studies and muscle studies and vision studies and cardiovascular studies really helps to branch out and to work with other groups and see the integration within the human being, and not just focused on a specific enzyme in a specific tissue in a petri dish in a lab somewhere in a basement. One of the great things about nutrition research on Space Station is that Space Station is a great platform and that it allows us to study very healthy individuals in a very strange environment, in a very unique environment that the body is trying to adapt to. And what that does, that allows us to understand how the body responds to these changes, and in many ways that reflects disease patterns or altered physiology, if you will, on Earth. So bone is a great example where when an astronaut is put into spaceflight, the body starts to break down bone because the body realizes it doesn't need the same skeleton in weightlessness as it did on Earth. And by looking at that adaptation and how to counteract that adaptation, that tells us about how the body responds to these different changes. So we see roughly the same change in bone in about 6 months on a space station mission as you would see in a much longer period, 4 or 5 years. So it's almost like time-lapse photography where we can see a much faster glimpse of what's going on. We can study countermeasures much more quickly. And again, the implications of those studies for people studying those same phenomena on Earth really helps to leapfrog some of the technology ahead. Hi, my name is Scott Smith. I'm the lead for the Nutritional Biochemistry Lab at the Johnson Space Center, and we're studying nutrition off the Earth for the Earth.
In space and on Earth, our bodies require proper nutrition. Defining the nutrient requirements for spaceflight and ensuring provision and intake of those nutrients are primary issues for astronaut health and mission success. After all, you are what you eat. One challenge is providing appetizing food for astronauts that doesn't require refrigeration and has a long shelf life. While the food is generally much better than you might imagine, and we have come a long way since the early days of spaceflight, we do have limited access to fresh foods. In our next segment, we'll go inside NASA's Space Food Systems Laboratory, as seen in the National Geographic Space Station Live program.
Eating in space is its own kind of fun. But keeping astronauts healthy is a serious business. Michelle Clinch is responsible for what they eat.
We're making spaghetti with meat sauce.
Space meals begin just like ours do, with a trip to the supermarket.
Thank you.
But the similarities stop there. Spaghetti and meat sauce is just one of the 250 things on the space station menu. Each portion is meticulously calibrated.
We have a database where we maintain the nutritional content of all our products, calories, fat, protein, carbohydrate, things like that.
But the most important calculation is what things weigh. That's because it costs $10,000 for every pound blasted off to the astronauts. So NASA adopted a reduction technique, also used by the military.
Freeze drying removes a high percentage of the moisture, so typically when we freeze dry our products, we take them down to about 3%.
Each portion now weighs just 1 ounce. Cost to transport, $660. 1,300 miles away, and the orbital Cygnus resupply module is being loaded with the freeze-dried food. And it's time for a few last-minute food luxuries.
These are the tortillas. They're very popular on orbit.
After a daily routine of freeze-dried meals, a fresh piece of fruit is a welcome relief, well worth its weight in gold.
As you can see, we're only sending 3 apples, so you may think that's unfair because we have 6 people on orbit. They may have to share.
This very precious cargo is one of the last things to be loaded onto the rocket.
It's on its way.
3, 2, 1.
Less than a kilometer away from us now.
2 days later, Cygnus docks with the space station.
We're getting ready to berth the Cygnus 1 vehicle. All right. Looks really good. Perfect. Perfect. All right. Bonus food.
Including some surprise treats from their families.
Wow. Look at that. Tortillas. The real tortillas. Look at that. Real tortillas.
pours it. Wow.
Oh my goodness gracious. The greatest hot dog relish in the history of man. Oh my gosh, my wife didn't tell me about this.
Hello, and welcome to Node 1. In the boxes you see here, we keep our food on the International Space Station, and specifically the food that we are currently eating. And in our logistics module, Leonardo, where I was just now, we keep our supplies. We keep them in soft containers like this one, which we call bobs. And this one is a very special bob for me because it contains my bonus food, the food that I chose myself based on my preference and my taste. This one, for example, is one of my absolute favorites. It's quinoa salad with mackerel. Mackerel is a great source of healthy proteins, but also of healthy fats. Those fats that our body absolutely needs to stay healthy and in good shape. On board we have different kinds of fish, which are great sources of healthy fat. For example, thanks to our Russian colleagues, we have sturgeon. In my bonus food, I also took sources of healthy fats that I can eat for a snack. I love avocado, for example, so I took it in form of guacamole that I can spread on my bread. Or I also love dry fruit, so I have almonds and nuts. And I didn't forget to take olive oil. And rehydrated veggies not only taste a lot better with olive oil, but they're also a lot healthier. So I hope you will put the right rocket fuel into your body, starting with the right types of fat. And remember, eating healthy is not rocket science.
You know, I don't know the reason behind it, but your taste buds change when you get to space. So the things that you like on Earth and you just can't get enough of, you've got enough of when you get to space. So there's something about your taste buds. Don't know what it is. However, aromas, you don't get enough of it, partly because of the way things are packaged. And coffee, for instance, has this smell that you kind of consume while you're eating the food, but it's in a package that has a straw. You can't smell anything. So it still didn't stop me from drinking it, but you just couldn't smell it. And same with all the other foods. They come in a little package, and so you don't really smell it very well. And you'd miss that. When you come back to Earth, you find out just how important smell is when you're eating food. So, how does the space station smell? You know, this is a good question because in general, the space station smells like nothing. It's clean, except if you're in Node 3 and you're working out on the ARED machine and all of a sudden you smell something that you think is coming from the WHC, but it's actually, which is our space potty, but it's actually our Russian colleagues back in the service module open up a can of beef, and it gets into the air circulation system, and it makes its first stop in Node 3. And so at first you're like, oh, what is that? And you're like, oh wait, it's lunchtime. And then it's a much better smell into your brain. You know, mealtime in space can be a lot of fun. It's especially dinner time. At the end of this long day where 6 little pink bodies in space, working all day long, and we're rarely together working unless it's something very unique. We're all off doing our own thing. And to come together at the end of the day when you know that you've signed off with mission control and you're in that evening period of time, that you can sit around a table with your crewmates and share food. And when you're an international crew and you have food from your Russian crewmates, your Japanese roommates, well, that's what we are, crewmates. When you have everybody coming together at the table to share their food, that's one of the best parts about eating in space.
So I just finished eating and I have to enter in what I ate because the ground folks like to keep track of it, keep track of our calories, how much salt we're getting, how much protein, things like that. They track us closely on everything. When we lift weights, we have to keep track of how much weight we lift, how many reps we do. When we run on the treadmill or when computers are recording our heart rate, when we turn on lights, when we turn on the toilets. I learned on my first mission there are no secrets in space. We got video cameras in just about all the modules. So it's basically like being in a big fishbowl. The ground knows everything about us up here, which is not that big a deal, but...
I'm just getting my safety cutter on the other side of my IDA back here. Copy, Terry. A lot easier without the pool stanchion.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just like in the pool instead of that, with the exception of that big blue planet down there.
Exactly.
As the International Space Station flies 257 statute miles over the coast of Chile, Terry Virts in the initial moments of his first spacewalk.
Welcome back, and thanks for watching this episode of Station Life. As you can see, space station nutrition research is vital towards improving the quality of human health and well-being in space and here on Earth. NASA is constantly searching for ways to benefit humanity as together we take the next steps towards exploring our universe, searching for the answers that matter to us the most. Thank you for joining us on Station Life and our behind-the-scenes look at nutrition research aboard the International Space Station. Be sure to stay in touch and follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest research news. And don't forget to download our fabulous app on your mobile device. Until next time, stay with us, off the Earth, for the Earth. I think it's time to eat. It's all about matters of the heart. Hi, I'm NASA astronaut Tracy Dyson. Welcome to Station Life. The focus of today's show is on matters of the heart as they relate to good cardiovascular health. We'll take a look at how NASA keeps astronauts' hearts healthy off the Earth. And we'll take a look at some of the research being done aboard the International Space Station that can keep all of us healthier here on the Earth.
Houston on 2 for velocity calculation. Assembly, steps 4, 5, and 4, 6. We're moving on to
Tracy,
step
you want
5.
to go right now for that activity?
Thank you.
Okay, Tracy, we copy, and that's good information. We'll pass it along.
Cardiovascular disease, including heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure, is the #1 killer of men and women across America. Fortunately, many studies have shown that healthy habits, including good nutrition and exercise, are important for maintaining heart here on Earth. Those habits are even more important for astronauts on the International Space Station. Living in microgravity for 6 months changes our bodies in a number of ways. Without gravity, we lose bone mineral density, our muscles atrophy, and our cardiovascular system gets weaker. Some of our studies have shown that in space, the size and shape of our hearts may actually change, which could make it difficult to do our jobs when we get back to Earth or even land on Mars. On Earth, our heart and blood vessels are well adapted to work against the downward pull of gravity. In space, however, there's a tendency for blood and other bodily fluids to accumulate in the upper body. Let's take a look at one of the consequences of this fluid shift.
We have recently identified that some astronauts experience changes in their vision, which might be related to the cardiovascular system. Our hearts pump blood around our body through blood vessels. Special adaptations in our bodies ensure that fluid is evenly distributed despite the pull of gravity. In space, astronauts no longer experience the downward pull of gravity, and the fluid in their bodies tends to move towards the upper body and the head. Our cranium is a rigid container. As the fluid moves towards the head, it causes the pressure inside the skull to rise. This is known as increased intracranial pressure. The optic nerve travels from the brain to the eye. The increased pressure from the cranium travels down the nerve and affects the eye. It causes the optic nerve to be squeezed, and the optic disc, where the optic nerve meets the eye, to swell. The back of the eyeball flattens as pressure builds behind it, and the blood vessels in the back of the eyeball also swell. These changes can affect the astronaut's vision. One change is that the astronauts become farsighted. A second change is that they can develop cotton wool spots, which represent damage of the nerve fibers in the back of the eye. These can cause discrete areas of vision loss. NASA is working to understand and prevent these changes in astronauts, which may also help us understand and prevent related vision changes here on Earth.
One of the tools we have to study heart health aboard the space station is an ultrasound device, which uses harmless sound waves to take images of the inside of our bodies. Those images can be viewed at the same time by researchers and doctors in mission control. With minimal training on the ultrasound, remote guidance techniques developed by NASA enabled astronauts to take detailed images of their own heart. In our next segment, we'll travel to a small community in Brazil that has benefited from remote medicine techniques that were advanced by the research aboard the International Space Station.
Minas Gerais é estado.
Minas Gerais is a large state. Our territory is about the size of France, and we consist of 853 units and municipalities. There are large distances between our communities and many very isolated rural communities.
Nós estamos utilizando nova tecnologia.
We are using new technology that impacts the quality of prenatal care and the diagnostic capacity of the primary care doctor in these situations involving distant, isolated communities.
Providing medical care for people in remote locations
like distant rural communities or the International Space Station, can be difficult because trained medical personnel are not always available. NASA research teams develop techniques that enable astronauts aboard the space station with minimal training to operate an ultrasound device using simple printed guide. The ultrasound images are transmitted in real time to a doctor back on Earth, who can make medical decisions without actually being aboard the station. These same techniques have been adapted for use with portable ultrasound devices in communities where expert medical care is not always available.
Estamos incorporando no componente da
We are also incorporating the first aid and components, improving first aid at the scene of the accident and enabling the use of ultrasound to communicate to the medical communication center. In the ambulance, we can use ultrasound in various situations. In those situations where time really matters, in which you have little time to make decisions. The idea of using ultrasound for healthcare is like an extension of the physical examination. You are able to conduct the exam with much more detail. And you can use it at the time to make a decision, or you can use telemedicine platforms to obtain a second opinion from someone at a distance.
Meu nome é Joaquim Edebilson Diniz.
My name is Joaquim Diniz. I'm a doctor in the town of Manga.
Manga, a gente vive uma
In Manga, people live with a particularity, and that is isolation.
Nós temos uma barreira geográfica que é o Rio São Francisco.
We have a geographical barrier that is the São Francisco River, which is both a blessing for the region, but it also isolates us.
Direita do Rio São Francisco. Nós vivemos numa região em que os
We live in a region where financial resources are few. People do not have a lot of work, but they are honest, good people who do not have much opportunity. So there are many needy people who need these resources and rely only on this institution to provide assistance.
E uma tecnologia dessa que vem.
This is a technology that helps us solve many problems.
Teve caso de uma paciente que estava com insuficiência respiratória grave.
That was the case of a patient who came to the hospital with severe respiratory failure, and the people realized she would die in just 20 to 30 minutes. We talked with Dr. Parzelli, who was training us to use the ultrasound. He came and applied the ultrasound and discovered large amounts of fluid around her lungs and heart. We performed the procedure and drained a lot of fluids. In 10 minutes, the woman immediately experienced an improvement and in half an hour was already walking. It was like a miracle, a rise and walk. She was dying in front of us without people knowing what was happening. This ultrasound was instrumental in saving the life of that patient.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, space geeks from all over the world, we have with us today a real treat. Dr. Koichi Wakata from the Japanese Space Agency and absolutely one of my favorite astronauts. Actually, in fact, wait a minute. I have a list right here, and I want to prove it. Look, Koichi.
Oh, great note.
TC's Top 10 Heroes of Space Travel. Look.
Wow!
He's on there. Welcome, Petit.
Good to see you, Tracy, here.
Nice to see you, too. Thank you for joining us on Station Life.
My pleasure. I'm always watching your program.
Really?
I'm glad to be here.
Oh, wow. Did you hear that? I am so excited that I'm actually honored that you watch our show. It's all about the space station, you know.
Yes. Yes, this is wonderful to be able to explain how wonderful it is to work and live on board the space station.
Yes.
And then today, what are we talking about?
Today we're talking about cardiovascular health.
Awesome.
Yes. And you know a thing or two about that?
Yes, we do exercise pretty much every day.
I was going to ask you on board, did you work out every single day?
I did, because it's not only, to keep, my body healthy, but also it's a very important cycle. It's just sitting right next to the cupola windows. Yes. It's probably the best view gym in the entire world, I
Absolutely.
think. Yeah, you can do the, muscle strengthening exercise, and at the same time you can see this beautiful, home planet. And what a wonderful place.
That's right, because we have the cupola and we have that big center window. We call it Window 7. And then most days, because the space station is oriented with the belly of the space station facing the Earth, which means that the cupola windows are facing the Earth. And there we are on the A-red, above it, below, however you want, whatever your perspective is. But anyways, we're right in line looking out that window, which seems to us like we're on a bench. We're doing our bench press and we're looking out that window. And I remember doing my exercise one day and I saw red soil go by and I'm like, that's Australia!
Exactly.
So yes. You can practice geography at the same time. Can you tell us a little bit about Sprint and what that was all about?
Right, Sprint exercise is a new protocol, and already several astronauts have tried that method. And basically, it uses the prescription of like a higher intensity of exercise, but less volume or less number of exercise days. For example, like if I on board the space station 7 years ago, I pretty much exercised like running for 40 minutes in the same pace. But here, as far as cardiovascular is concerned, we have like a sprint running, like for 30 seconds sprint, and 15 seconds rest, another 30 seconds of run. But it's only like 6 or 7 minutes, very short interval, but high intensity training. And you do that like 3 times a week instead of 7 days a week.
Wow.
And so it's like a smaller number of days of exercise, but the higher intensity. And that's part of the sprint protocol. So 7 years ago when I was on board the space station, I used the previous protocol, which I exercise every day. But this time, it's a smaller amount of time actually. But the results were pretty good. I was able to walk right after landing. And so I think this new protocol is working very well.
Wow, so if you compared when you were on board and landed 7 years ago to now, when you did this new protocol and you exercised more and you had probably more emphasis on the exercise because you have more equipment to work with.
Right.
A big difference, did you notice?
As for after landing, I don't see very much difference. So that means that's such a very efficient way to do exercise, because if the results are the same, if you spend less time and exercise, that means it's a very efficient way of exercising. So maybe we can utilize that in the future when we go to beyond low Earth orbit, when we go to Mars, and then so a lot of new protocols are being tested on board the station.
Yeah, and I can see where folks back here at home who don't have time to exercise pay attention to this, because you can spend less time working out and get the same benefits as if you were working out for 2 hours or something.
Right.
And you have done just a tremendous amount of work, Koichi, not just in your most recent increment, but throughout your career in the space program, and you've been an asset to Japan and to NASA and to the International Space Station and to station life. So thank you so much for being here with us, spending so much time sharing your stories. We've just had a lot of fun with you. So wish you all the best as we go forward. I'll see you, probably in 5 minutes. But, thank you so much for being here with us.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Tracy.
Likewise.
Glad to be here.
Cool.
Just curious.
I think they can access the ice in here.
Yeah, depending on how much water pressure we have that day, we can do 60 to any amount at pretty much any time. If we have good water pressure, we can get you up to around 80. But you're saying Tracy's taking almost all of it.
No, you're the one I'm going to wait.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Just wanted to give you a boost of confidence.
Indeed.
So with all this exercise going on, Is it really working? Researchers and ACERs, who are astronaut strength conditioning and rehabilitation specialists, have made great progress. Before we had a full gym on the space station, our astronauts needed quite a bit of recovery time back here on Earth. Today, our astronauts are coming home in excellent health.
My name is Mark Williams. I'm the lead astronaut strength and conditioning coach. On board at the International Space Station, we have 3 pieces of hardware. We have a cycle, which we call CVIS. We have a treadmill, which is called T2, and we have a resistive exercise device, which is called ARED. And each device is specifically designed to do certain things for the astronaut. We try to do one of those particular devices every other day. One of them we're going to get a little bit better cardiovascular fitness out of it. The other one we get a little bit more impact loading, like running on the ground. So that affects muscle, it'll affect a little bit of bone, does things. Those are the physiological aspects of it. But then also making sure when they come home from a 6-month flight that they don't come home like a bowl of jello. You know, they're going to lose muscle, they're going to lose strength, they're going to lose bone, they're going to lose cardiovascular fitness. But at the same time, then we have to take them, get them back to where they were before they left, which is what we do in our post-flight period once they come home for about 6 to 8 weeks. And just get them prepared back to normal life, you know, doing their job, doing with their family, doing yard work, whatever that happens to be.
Have you ever been sedentary for a long period of time, like lying in bed for a week because of an illness or surgery, and then stood up quickly? Did you feel like you might fall or that not all your senses were functioning? Hi, I'm Dr. John Charles with NASA's Human Research Program. During the 1-year International Space Station mission, NASA will conduct functional studies to gain insight into key physiological factors that contribute to changes in performance. Just like it would take minutes, hours, or even days for your body to acclimate to standing after lying in bed for weeks, it takes time for an astronaut's body to acclimate to an environment with gravity after working without it for many months. 2 tests will focus on post-flight tasks and procedures that will be vital for an exploration crew that has just landed on a planet after a prolonged period of weightlessness. The functional studies will assess how the neurosensory networks, eye-hand coordination, fluid distribution, cardiovascular, and skeletal muscle performance all work together to accomplish an integrated task or function. Researchers hope to compile a post-flight recovery timeline and develop and validate tests to define acceptable performance and define the linkage between physiological changes and functional capacity. This information will be helpful for astronauts and researchers as they prepare for future long-duration missions to asteroids, Mars, and beyond. To learn more about NASA's Human Research Program, visit www.nasa.gov.
So now let's hear from one of our researchers who is studying the cardiovascular system off the Earth for the Earth.
My name is Stuart Lee. I'm the lead research scientist in the Cardiovascular and Vision Laboratory at Johnson Space Center. So the astronauts in space flight is somewhat analogous to if you took one of us on the ground and told us not to exercise for a long period of time. So spaceflight has allowed us to see the deconditioning effects, and we can see all the negative things that can happen when you don't exercise, when you don't do physical work every day that we're actually genetically designed to do. So I would say that cardiovascular health is important from the aspect of the heart and the blood vessels are the communication system in your body. So the experiment that they're demonstrating in the background is the primary measurements in our cardiovascular experiment called CardioWalks. And it's primarily looking at the health and function of the arteries in your body. In this particular case, they're scanning the brachial artery, and we use that as a surrogate for the arteries in your heart, the coronary arteries. So we're able to see how they would respond to stress. And obviously, if they respond well, then we've got good cardiovascular health, and it has a good prognosis long-term for the health of the heart. So they're looking specifically at how the vessel expands and contracts with each heartbeat. And then we stress the vessel and we see how well it expands. And those are key functions in your ability to adapt to stress when you're exercising or when you're experiencing orthostatic or gravitational stress. And so it gives us a way that we can look at throughout the mission and after the mission how the crew members are responding to the spaceflight experience. So Cardiox is looking primarily at the health and fitness, as you might say, of the arteries. The unique part of Cardiox is we're actually looking at 5 years after the mission. So most experiments just look some in and post-flight. We're actually interested in long-term health of the crew members 5 years later, where their stress is involved with spaceflight, which might have caused some issues for them. Sprint is another experiment that looks at cardiovascular, but it looks primarily at the cardiovascular fitness end of things, how hard you can work. We call it VO2 max or maximal oxygen consumption. How hard you can get your body to work during space. And the VO2 max test is very good because it's an integrative test of the cardiovascular system. It brings together all the function of the cardiovascular system so you can work as hard as possible. So these experiments together give us an idea of what's happening on the functional side of things, the Sprint study, and then on the I don't want to say pathological, but on the health side of things with Cardiox. And then with the Cardiox Twins experiment, we're also then looking at how genetics affects those things. My name is Stuart Lee. I'm a lead research scientist in the Cardiovascular and Vision Laboratory at Johnson Space Center. We're working off the Earth for the Earth.
Our International Space Station provides an unprecedented research platform in space, allowing doctors and scientists to conduct science experiments that can't be done anywhere else. For NASA, keeping our astronauts' heart healthy is vital for continuing the journey off the Earth. Here on the Earth, the keys to good heart health are good nutrition and vigorous exercise. Thanks for joining us on Station Life at our behind-the-scenes look at cardiovascular research being done aboard the International Space Station. And as always, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest research news, and download our app, which is legit, on your mobile device. Until next time, we're working off the Earth for the Earth.
Did you know that when you look up in the dark night sky, you are in a way looking back in time? It's really true. Much of the light you see coming from the stars has been traveling across space for millions of years by the time it reaches us here on Earth. Some of those stars that you can see tonight in the night sky may have burned out millions of years ago. If you have ever wondered where stars come from, how they change, and what happens to them when their life comes to an end, hang with me for a few minutes as this episode of NASA Launchpad takes a closer look at the life cycle of stars. And bonus, we're going to talk a little bit about how each of us is actually made from dead stars. Yeah, really. Most things in the universe have a life cycle. Thankfully, for some things, like these guys, the life cycle is incredibly short. But for other things like stars, the life cycle can be billions of years long. The life cycles for stars begin in giant stellar nurseries called nebulae. If you look at one of these star-forming nebulae, you will see beautiful giant clouds of dust and gas. How a star forms is a little technical, so let's hear an explanation from an expert.
A star is basically a nuclear furnace. It's this collection of mostly hydrogen gas, and at the center is really, really hot and dense, where you can actually get nuclear fusion occurring, and that's how you get the heat and the light from the star. In space, you have this collection of sort of diffuse gas and dust particles. It's just sort of everywhere in space. Occasionally, it comes together through gravity. Attracted to itself, basically. And so you get these giant molecular clouds, they're called, these big nebulae. As that stuff comes together through its own gravity, you eventually get these places where you have enough material where you can start to form a star, where it all comes together and the gravity pushes on it so hard that it heats up in the center, and that heating up is what will eventually lead to fusion and the birth of a star. Two of the most important properties of a star are its color and its brightness. And so if you take stars and you sort of sort them by color, you get anything from red to blue, where the red stars will be the cooler stars and the blue stars will be the hotter stars. So that's really a measure of temperature. And then you can also sort them by their brightness. And so you have the very bright stars, which are usually the more massive stars, and the dimmer stars, which are usually less massive. And just by these two parameters, you can actually tell a lot from a star. You can tell how massive it is, you can tell how big it is, its radius, you can tell how old it is, you can know what stage of evolution it's in, and you can learn about the environment of the star, that the star was born in.
As you know, our sun is a star. It is actually a fairly modest-sized star. It is believed that our sun is about halfway through its 10 billion year life cycle. Yes, that makes our sun about 5 billion years old. But don't worry, we're all good for at least another 5 billion more years. So, how will our sun's life cycle play out?
So our sun is a low-mass star, and it's actually going to go through a really long evolution. It's going to be in the phase that it's currently in, where it's just fusing hydrogen into helium, for about 10 billion years. And then once it runs out of fuel in its center, it's going to evolve into a red giant star, a red meaning that it's going to be cooler, and it's going to be so large that its outer radius is actually going to reach the Earth's orbit. It's going to be a huge star. And then eventually it'll blow off its outer layers and become a white dwarf star, and that will be its final phase.
So at the end of a massive star's life, we have what's called a core collapse supernova. So the core region collapses in on itself, and the outer region infalls and then rebounds, and you get left with a neutron star or a black hole.
You may have noticed that no matter the size of the star, at the end of its life cycle, most of its material is expelled back into clouds of dust and gas in the galaxy. The life cycle of a star can begin again.
Throughout a star's life, it's throwing off material, and this material has been enriched by nuclear fusion reactions. So originally, really only hydrogen and a little bit of helium was produced in the Big Bang. And all of the elements that we get after that have been produced in either a star's life or in its explosion, if it's massive enough to explode. And that material gets mixed in with the other gases and dust in the interstellar medium and produces the next generation of stars. So every generation of stars that you produce is more and more enriched with material from the life and death of stars.
So what does all of this mean for us? And what is our connection to the cosmos?
All of that fusion that's going on in the centers of stars is creating heavier and heavier elements, and that's how you get basically everything you see around you, from the carbon to the iron, the oxygen, everything. You can't get any of those elements without having a star forming it in the first place. And so everything that your body is made up, everything that you see around you, all came from the center of a star.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? When you look at that periodic table hanging in your science class, it represents all of the natural and man-made elements. Most of those natural elements were formed and fused inside of long dead stars. Yeah, that's right. Everything around you, including you and me, was formed from the remnants of exploded stars and the birth of the universe. We may look and act differently from each other, but we are all made up of the same stuff. Want to find out more? You can learn more about stars and their life cycles from these NASA websites. That's it for now. See you next time on NASA Launchpad.
Hey, you're watching NASA TV, on the air and online every day, on this planet and beyond. It's all about the Earth and what we can learn about it from the International Space Station. Hi, I'm NASA astronaut Tracy Dyson. Welcome to Station Life.
Houston on 2 for velocity confirmation. Go ahead and leave steps 4, 5, and 4, 6. We're moving on to step 5.
You will go right now for that activity.
Copy. Thank you.
Okay, Tracy, we copy, and that's good information. We'll pass it along.
Welcome back. This month on Station Life, we're going to highlight the International Space Station as a platform for studying the Earth and take a behind-the-scenes look at what it's like to live and work aboard the International Space Station. You know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. The first pictures taken by humans from space forever changed the way we view ourselves and our world. If you've ever flown on an airplane in the window seat, you know the natural desire to stare out the window. Well, aboard the International Space Station, one of our favorite things to do during our off time is to stare at the beauty of our home planet.
Take a moment every day to look out the window and appreciate where you are.
Literally watch the Earth go by. We're going around the Earth once every 90 minutes. So you see a sunrise and a sunset every hour and a half.
It's just so vast and so vibrant in color, and so much contrast between the black that it kind of overwhelms you at first.
Don't just look out the window during the day. Go for the times between day and night, and then night and day, and take some time to look out into the universe at nighttime, because that's when you can really see all the stars. And you can see that the stars are not only like in a planetarium where they're sort of in a 2D field, they're actually 3D, and some are farther than others.
But you could see the blues and the oranges and the reds and the whites and the yellows, and really see more color about the stars, which indicates more about where they are in their life cycle, what kind of things they're burning and doing. And you would think that you'd get tired of looking out the window, but you never do.
Like I said before, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But in the case of International Space Station imagery, a picture could also be worth 1,000 lives. An imaging system aboard the station called Environmental Research and Visualization System, ISERV, captured photographs of Earth from space for use in developing countries affected by natural disasters. This is yet another way the orbiting laboratory is serving humanity off the Earth for the Earth.
SERVIR is a joint NASA and USAID program where we're working with developing countries around the world and strengthening their ability to use satellites to address the many problems that they have, including floods, fires, harmful algal blooms, and other types of events that they have where they can use satellites to really make better decisions.
We're using space information to help decisions that affect people in the village where they live.
When there's a major disaster, governments around the world come together, and they provide all of the satellite data basically that the world has to offer. But there's smaller disasters that occur in the countries that we work in that may not make the front page of the New York Times, but in that country it's a really big deal. We asked ourselves, could we make a difference if we had a dedicated imager for acquiring imagery quickly after natural disasters, and to be able to provide that imagery back to the countries that need them, that have real decisions that need to be made with a very quick turnaround. As NASA, we looked in our own backyard and started thinking, could we use the International Space Station? The International Space Station was really a fantastic asset to take advantage of because it passes over 90% of the Earth's populated area every 24 hours. We developed an imaging system and we called it ISERV, which basically is a camera and a telescope system that sits inside the International Space Station and can collect imagery when it passes over natural disasters or other events that we need to collect imagery.
Initially, we were planning to take a few pictures per day.
So we contacted all the USAID missions around the world, and in total we had more than 2,000 requests coming, for people who need images from ISERV.
And we moved to like 1,000 images per day.
We provided ISERV imagery for many, many natural disasters, including floods and fires, for deforestation, for volcanic eruptions, for earthquakes. So it was really a fantastic example showing how imagery from the International Space Station could be used in these times of dire need.
And now we have a huge archives of images of areas around the world. So this is something that was not really there before.
ISERV is an example of, in essence, making the International Space Station even more international and connecting space to village to better understand and protect our home planet.
Imagine bread loaf-sized satellites zipping around the Earth each day, imaging the globe and providing updates on the environment. Thanks to the International Space Station, this constellation of satellite image gathering has been made a reality. With the mission of photographing the majority of the Earth every day, Planet Labs created small satellites, individually referred to as doves, to capture ground imagery for use in humanitarian, environmental, and commercial applications. With the 2005 NASA Authorization Act designating the U.S. segment of the station as a national laboratory, the space station drives growth of a robust commercial marketplace in space through endeavors like Planet Labs. The Earth imaging mission of Planet Labs Dove satellites takes another leap toward creating benefits on Earth, resulting from innovation in space.
What happens if you wake up in the morning and you understand the state of the world as it is right now?
What could that data enable? How could people make smarter decisions? How could, for example, a farmer get better yield on his or her crops? How could somebody help disaster response? How can we use satellites to help humanity? That in many ways was the underlying thesis of doing Planet Labs, was to get data into the hands of people that could enable us to make smarter responses to that.
Planet Labs set out with the mission to photograph the entire Earth every day. And they thought, how are we going to do this? They said, let's build our own satellite.
Commercial imaging satellites, they're very large. They are very expensive. We took a different approach.
By making them really small, we can launch lots of them, and by launching lots of them, we can cover this, to get to this mission of imaging the whole Earth every day.
If we can do that, then we can literally change the way that we see the world.
And they called it the Dove. It's about the size of a loaf of bread.
Our doves are basically mainly a big camera with a telescope looking down to take pictures of the Earth. We initially developed the first Dove satellite in our garage. So we kept on iterating the Dove design, we made it better and better, and eventually we put our first one into space. We had no idea what the quality would be like.
I mean, we didn't know if it was going to work.
But we got an image down and it was so beautiful that we knew at that point we could make this technology work.
Wow, we can really do this, and we can achieve this which is something that is really needed for us to understand global change.
So we had done a couple of demonstration satellites, but the next steps we wanted to do was to scale it up, to test the first fleets of satellites.
But what made that possible was actually access to space.
So here's the problem, that in order to take pictures of the entire Earth every day, you're going to need more than one or two satellites. You're going to need a whole lot of satellites, and you're going to need to be able to deploy them really fast. And really, there's only one obvious choice on how to deploy that, and that's the International Space Station.
There was no other platform in the world in order to get access to space of that fashion in that time period than the International Space Station.
NanoRacks is our key partner with NASA.
At NanoRacks, we understood Planet Labs' vision, and we knew that we could help. We worked together to figure out what was going to be the best way to get as many satellites as possible, and we basically developed a new platform. It goes out of the gym airlock. It's picked up by a robotic arm, pointed out into space, and it fires these little satellites off of the space station.
They were able to secure 28 of our satellites to be launched from the International Space Station, and that was known as Flock 1, our first constellation.
This opened up the whole world to satellite developers, people that could put things into orbit fast.
We now deploy these on a regular basis from the International Space Station. And now today, we're able to operate the largest fleet of Earth imaging satellites in human history.
And none of that would have been possible without the International Space Station.
The International Space Station does enable young, small companies like ourselves to get going in space.
The ISS provides a lot of opportunities for commercial companies to test and find where the market in space is going to be.
And so what we're seeing today is a proliferation of new ideas and new concepts. It's almost like it's a renaissance of what's happening in space. Buckle up and strap down, because this is going to be a rocket for all of us in the global community to be part of.
I used to think when I was growing up in Florida, lots of thunderstorms in Florida, you know, that here's this storm over top of me, and it's just this individual little thing that just is about a storm over Florida. And in fact, now after looking at the Earth from space, I see that that little storm in Florida is connected to Africa and Europe and all across the planet. And one of the most impressive things to see is how the Earth presents itself as alive when you're watching these storms at night just trickle across the whole surface of the planet like its own nervous system. And the emotions of the Earth, you know, seeing storms that are developing, and the way you know from having that experience on Earth how it's probably impacting the people and the places down there. It's like, oh, is it upset and mad today versus the sunshine over some other part of the planet? And really, really, really gets you looking at it in a different way, an appreciative and respectful way. When you're crossing the deserts in Africa and the way the dunes form, and they almost look like little, birds have run across the sand. And then this contrast you'll get from kind of the pinks and oranges and whites to these dark grays and almost deep blues and of rocks and everything that are intersecting with it. And the Bahamas and the northern coast of Venezuela, which quite honestly is, I think, the most beautiful place on our planet. It is just incredible. Yeah.
Well, so far we've learned about using the ISS as a platform for iServe, which captures imagery of the Earth to provide disaster assistance, and deploying small satellites called doves. We expect good things to come from both of these experiments and look forward to their robust potential. NASA has selected proposals for 2 new future instruments, Getty and EcoStress. These sensors on the ISS will give scientists new ways to observe how forests and ecosystems are affected by climate change. Our next piece is about a recently completed mission of an Earth-observing instrument on the ISS called HYCO. Its name stands for Hyperspectral Imager for the Coastal Ocean. Check it out.
Carroll Township's a very rural area in northern Ohio, right on Lake Erie. Lake Erie has always been very important to Carroll Township and its residents. We use it for drinking water, we treat it, and it's really our livelihood.
In Lake Erie, for what unknown reason, suddenly the toxin level spiked, and that got through the treatment system.
It was indicated to me that it is pretty dangerous.
Cyanotoxins can cause skin rashes,
headaches,
nausea,
vomiting, stomach problems,
nervous system problems,
liver damage,
to death.
We sampled, and we had about 2.5 times the limit from the World Health Organization. The second sample was approximately 3.5 times. Our plant wasn't set up to handle what was coming in from Lake Erie. One of my biggest worries was actually hurting someone or even worse. So we shut it off right away, shut everything off. We had a very close call that day. The last thing you want to do is produce an unsafe water and allow your people to drink it. What we need is a better way to track and predict these cyanobacteria entries from our source water so that we can make sure that this never happens again.
A lot of times we'll find out after the fact that there's a problem with cyanobacteria in the water because the blooms already occurred. We either get results of sick animals or sick people. We need a paradigm shift. We need to go from being constantly reactive to these blooms to having a capability that allows us to become proactive. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has been very encouraging of allowing for some high-risk, high-reward projects. And that allowed us to think outside the box, way outside the box. We've been fortunate enough to make use of a sensor on the International Space Station called HYCO, which stands for the Hyperspectral Imager for the Coastal Ocean.
HYCO consists of 2 instruments. One is a camera,
And the second instrument is a spectrophotometer, which actually gives us the spectrum of light leaving that water.
The camera on a cell phone, for example, contains about 3 bands of data in a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel.
HICO gathers light from the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet parts of the spectrum. So using this technology, we're able to now detect those water quality parameters such as water clarity, what the phytoplankton concentration is in your water, how much light is being absorbed in your water, as well as what's the distribution of cyanobacteria in those waters, and does that concentration pose a health hazard?
So what this means is instead of waiting for someone to report that there's a problem with cyanobacteria bloom, we can monitor these water bodies from space
and get information that we can rapidly get out to the water quality managers through a smartphone application that we've developed.
So the app allows you to drop a pinpoint, and that pin can be placed in an area where a drinking water treatment plant may have an intake, and see what the current water quality conditions were. Each user gets that information near real time, so they can make judgment calls on whether they have to respond or take action.
Having the HICO on the International Space Station has been the ideal test bed for our research.
This is an amazing partnership. The Naval Research Laboratory had HICO on NASA's International Space Station. As HICO acquired a scene, it was transferred to the Naval Research Laboratory. And then the Environmental Protection Agency was able to do the analysis and the validation to send this information out through a prototype mobile application. Yes, this technology will reduce costs and provide near real-time information. But the big goal here is protecting humans. And if we can reduce exposures both to humans and even animals, then we've achieved our goal.
Our International Space Station is an unprecedented research platform in space, allowing researchers and scientists to conduct experiments that can't be done anywhere else. Utilizing the ISS as a ready-built platform for studying the Earth is well underway. So far, we've learned about iServe, Planet Lab's Dove satellites, and HICO. 2 more experiments, or payloads in NASA speak, are on schedule to get to the ISS later this year. There's SAGE-3 and Lightning Imaging Sensor. SAGE-3 will measure ozone and other gases in the upper atmosphere to help scientists assess the ozone layer and how it's recovering. And the Lightning Imaging Sensor will monitor global lightning for Earth science studies and support operational weather forecasting and warning. Looks like utilizing the ISS to further benefit all of humankind? It's right on track. Thanks for joining us on Station Life at our behind-the-scenes look at using the International Space Station as a platform for studying the Earth. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest research news. And don't forget to download our straight-up gangsta app on your mobile device. It's totally legit. Until next time, we're working off the Earth for the Earth.
Ever think you might want to be a scientist? Or that you could work with NASA? Well, thanks to citizen science programs, you can. Find out how next on Real World. picture a scientist, what comes to mind? A person in a white coat? Someone stuck in a lab? Actually, scientists are pretty interesting people doing some really amazing work. And while some scientists do work in a lab, others work in the field, under the water, or on the computer, the one thing scientists all have in common is that they're looking for answers to some serious real-world problems. But sometimes they need help, so they turn to citizen scientists to assist with their research. Citizen scientist.
I think people are aware that NASA has many different missions. We have missions to Mars, we have missions to Saturn, we have many different missions that are observing Earth. There's all this data coming in, and quite honestly, scientists don't have time to go through it all themselves, and we need people to look at this data to tell us what discoveries might be waiting there for us. So this is a way for the general public to do serious, publishable science with us, results that we need.
One of the longest running citizen science programs is GLOBE, or the Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment program. GLOBE students from around the world conduct research to measure and monitor changes in their environment. These citizen scientists learn to use specific tools before they go out in the field or begin their work on a computer. And they follow a protocol, which is a special set of steps to do their research. Think of a protocol just like following a recipe for a cake. But why are protocols so important?
The most powerful thing about science is that it is a tool to actually discover things about reality. But we all need to make the same measurements in the same way. You have to design an experiment so that anybody, anywhere in the world could do it the same way and get similar results. There's a thing called a scientific protocol, and this means that wherever you are, we're using the same tools with the same precision, and that means we can all compare our results. For example, let's say that somebody asked you to measure the temperature of where you are. Are you measuring in Celsius or Fahrenheit? What time of day did you take the measurements? Did you do it at nighttime or during the daytime? If we simply ask people what temperature is it, we get all kinds of numbers that don't make sense. But if we specify it needs to be this accurate, you need to use these units, you need to measure at this time of day, then all of a sudden we can bring all of this information together and compare it and find trends and make real discoveries about what the world is doing. That's the power of the precision of the tools of science, and that's what a scientific protocol really means.
Citizen science projects may also require you to practice some of your math skills. NASA School, for example, may ask you to estimate the percentage of cloud cover in the sky. Another project might ask for the percent of a leaf that has been damaged by ozone. When the same scientific protocols or steps are used to collect data, that data can be analyzed by scientists to help them better understand the problem they're trying to solve. So what are some other opportunities for citizen scientists to collaborate with NASA?
So which citizen science project should you choose? Well, this is your chance to do a little shopping and let your own curiosity be the guide. The wonderful thing about citizen science is you don't need any special skills to get involved. You, as you stand right now, are prepared to do these projects with us. To me, you really need some curiosity. Are you curious about the planets or about the Earth or the universe? And if you can give us some precision, do the measurements as carefully as you possibly can, that will give us the best results. But you need no special training. Start it tomorrow.
It's pretty easy to get started. Just go to the NASA Citizen Science website, pick a program that catches your interest, then be sure to make careful observations and follow the protocol exactly. Get out there and help. You really can make a difference. See you next time on Real World.
Hey, you're watching NASA TV, on the air and online every day, on this planet and beyond.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, everybody? You're watching NASA in Silicon Valley Live for December 6th. I'm your host, Cassandra Bell. And if you didn't know, this is NASA in Silicon Valley Live, a conversational talk show out of NASA Ames Research Center with the various scientists, engineers, and researchers and all around cool things that you need to know about. I'm here with my co-host, Abby Tabor.
Hey, Cassandra. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. If you like that nerdy NASA news, we are simultaneously live on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. But if you want to join us in the chat and ask our guests questions, you got to join us on Twitch. So that is twitch.tv/NASA. And if you can't catch us live, no big deal. We'll have the video on demand later, including on NASA TV. And if you want to listen to the audio-only version, you can catch us on your favorite podcast service. So today I'm very happy to introduce you to our special guests, Andrew and Jim. Can you tell us your full name and just a little bit about what you do here?
Sure. My name is Andrew Helton, and I'm a research scientist here at NASA Ames, and I study evolved stars, so stars nearing the end of their lifetimes.
Ah, interesting. Cool.
And I'm Jim DeBiser. I'm a scientist here at Ames as well. My main field of research is how stars form, and I also work on astronomical instrumentation. So these are the cameras and instruments that we put at the back end of the telescope that collects the light, that takes the image or studies the object in space that we want to observe.
Okay. That's pretty essential for astronomy,
Certainly is.
right?
Yeah. So today we're here to talk about airborne astronomy. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means, airborne astronomy?
Yeah, so when you think about astronomy, you might think about the dome on the top of a mountain in an isolated mountain range somewhere, or you might think of a satellite in space. But one of the other places you can do astronomy is from the atmosphere, and that can be from a balloon or from a sounding rocket. But what we're going to concentrate on talking about today is astronomy from planes, so putting a telescope on a plane to observe space.
Okay.
Telescopes on planes.
That's clearly awesome, a telescope on a plane, but why would you do that? What's the advantage?
Sure. There are a number of different advantages to having a telescope on a plane. You can imagine that not all astronomical events happen at the same place on the surface of the Earth. And so sometimes you might need to take your observatory to where that event's going to occur. And of course, a plane's a mobile platform, so you can go anywhere you want.
Yeah.
And so that's one reason. Also, you have people on board. So if you have problems with your instruments during a flight, rather than being stuck in space where you can't access them, you're right there. And so you can work on it. The plane comes home every night. And so you can make changes to the instrumentation. You can make repairs as they're needed.
Right, right.
And then in addition, since you're flying on a plane, you can get up into the atmosphere where you can start to see emission that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see from the ground. You start to see wavelengths of light that are impossible to detect from a ground-based observatory.
Okay, tell us more about that. What is a wavelength of light that we're not going to see down here?
So, for example, our eyes are sensitive to optical light, so the visual portion of the spectrum, which is actually just a very small fraction of the total spectrum of light.
Like the rainbow?
Like the rainbow, yeah. The rainbow is
visible
just a
section,
very, very
right?
narrow portion of all of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. And so if you're wanting to observe in the infrared portion of the spectrum, which is a wavelength just a little bit longer than visual, you're not going to be able to see that from the ground because the atmosphere absorbs most of that.
Okay, so infrared is like remote controls, right? Like
Yeah.
for the TV, that's how that works, to change the channel.
That's right. And so your eye can't see it,
No.
right? But you clearly see that it's affecting your television, right? And that's infrared radiation, and that's what we're looking at.
That's what you're looking at.
Oh,
Awesome.
Light we can't see with our
Light
eyes.
that you can't see with your eyes, that's
Okay.
right.
Well, I think we have an infrared camera to see what we look like in
awesome.
infrared.
Nice. Let's play that.
There it is.
There's Andrew and Jim. Hi, guys.
Infrared. Awesome.
And so here, this is emission from warm objects, right? And so if you're looking at this display here, anything that's dark is cool for the most part, although Jim might talk about that. Anything that is bright is warm. And the exception...
So yeah, you see my forehead and my mouth are pretty hot because they're the sort of the brighter yellow colors. My nose is cold. It's darker. My glasses look very dark, but that's not because it's cold. It's because the infrared light can't actually go through my glasses. If I take off my glasses, you can see my eyes. They're pretty hot, but I put my glasses back on, and then the infrared light can't penetrate through that.
Okay, very cool.
Very cool.
This is like predator vision.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that true?
That's right. It's similar to what Predator saw heat, and so when he was looking for his victims, he looked with heat vision.
Okay. Good to know. I have a question from the chat from Bandit CRN. Why is it important to use an infrared telescope for space exploration, and what do you hope to learn from this? So, like, why would you look at this kind of light?
Right. So, as Andrew said, the optical light that we see with our eyes are only a very small part of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So, in order to understand what's going on in space, we want to look at other wavelengths to see what other wavelengths these objects emit at. Now, it turns out that stars, the surface of stars, give off light that we see with our eyes, and most of the things that other things that we see are because that light is reflected off those objects to us, so we can see them. But the great part about the infrared is all objects have heat, and that's what the infrared traces. And so all objects give off infrared light. In fact, a majority of the light in the universe is given off at the infrared wavelength. So it allows us to observe almost every astronomical object in space at a very interesting wavelength that we can't see with our eyes.
Okay. So you said we can see things in infrared that we can't see in visible light. So I think we have a picture of visible and infrared light to sort of
compare
what this. Here we go.
Right, so here we have an image of the Sombrero Galaxy, and you'll notice that there's a halo of what are isolated stars, mostly isolated stars, but then around the waist of the galaxy, there are these dark lanes, and those dark lanes are lanes of gas and dust, and they're dark because they're absorbing a lot of that visual light, the portion of the rainbow spectrum that our eyes can see. They're absorbing that material. So if we go to the next
If we
image,
go into infrared,
here
same
we
galaxy.
go.
Wow.
Same galaxy, but now you'll notice that what was dark in the last image is now illuminated because it's emitting the infrared light. So it's
pink.
absorbing the optical, but it's emitting in the infrared.
And you don't see the stars
And
anymore.
you don't see the stars as well.
Okay. So that pink is the dust glowing.
And that's the dust glowing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Very cool.
Yeah, so the other advantage about working in the infrared is it has a penetrating power. And what I mean by that is a lot of times in the center of galaxies or where stars are forming, they're surrounded by a lot of gas and dust, which makes it impossible for us to see what's going on with our eyes or with optical wavelengths. But the infrared light comes through, so we can detect that and we can see how stars are forming. So the analogy to that is firefighters, when they go into a burning building, there's a lot of smoke. They might not be able to see the people they're trying to save if they don't have goggles, which are IR goggles, which allows them to see through the smoke and see the heat signatures of the people, the bodies of the people who they're trying to save. So it's a very similar technology in what we're doing in astronomy. So
that is cool.
So that sounds like a very on the ground kind of use for infrared, but why would we use airplanes to do infrared astronomy?
Airplanes, as I mentioned earlier, allow us to get up higher into the atmosphere, and infrared is absorbed in our atmosphere by water vapor. And water vapor is very efficient at absorbing infrared radiation. And so in our atmosphere, it turns out that most of that water vapor is at the lower levels of the atmosphere. And if you get as high as what we call the stratosphere, it becomes very dry. And so you can now see in the infrared. It's now transparent where we're trying to observe.
Okay.
And so once it gets to the stratosphere, yeah.
Okay, so I think we have an illustration to sort of show what that is, what we mean by the stratosphere. And maybe while we're waiting, here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah. So you'll see there's two layers of the atmosphere here. There's these rays of infrared light, which are shown as red. And you see as they come down through the stratosphere and into the lower atmosphere, they start to become attenuated or drop off. And the light doesn't make it all the way to the ground. However, there's a plane there in the stratosphere where it's intercepting that infrared light. So that could be the light from an astronomical object, for instance. And so that's the reason why we try to get up there into the stratosphere.
Yeah. A bunch of people want to know, like Resonator Games is asking how high do these telescope planes fly? So what's the altitude for Sophia right there?
Normal cruising altitude for when we're doing observations is anywhere between 39 and 43,000 feet.
Okay.
So what is that in relation to where a commercial plane would fly?
So a commercial plane flies about 35,000 feet.
Okay.
But at that height, it gets us above 99% of the Earth's water vapor in the atmosphere. So
when we're up around 40.
Around 40,000 feet,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
So
Excellent.
NASA's been putting telescopes on planes for quite a while.
Yes. That is
And we
true.
have some models here to talk about all these telescopes on
I
planes.
do. I have an early example here. This is the Learjet, right?
Right, so this is the NASA's Learjet Observatory. So this was one of the earliest airborne observatories in the infrared. And it started flying in the late 60s. It had a telescope that was 12 inches in diameter on board. And so that's a modest-sized telescope. Yeah, it's about that big in diameter, about that long. A lot of people who are amateur astronomers have telescopes of that size in their backyard, but in this case, it was one of the first infrared telescopes. So we're looking at the infrared part of the spectrum. So it did make a lot of discoveries. And if you see here in the front, the hole here, it's not really a hole, but that's the telescope sitting out or pointing out the side of the plane.
And what you mentioned some discoveries made from this Learjet.
Yeah, so I think there were a lot of discoveries made because, again, it was one of the first infrared observatories. But one of the interesting ones was it totally changed how we perceived or how we thought about Venus. Okay. So prior to these observations, a little bit prior to these observations, we knew that Venus had lots of clouds in its atmosphere. We knew that it's about the size of the Earth, but it's a little bit closer to the sun. So a lot of people thought that, well, Venus is probably like this very lush tropical paradise, lots of rain, maybe even vegetation or plants and things on the surface. And just before these Learjet observations, they found that there was no water in the clouds of Venus. And the Learjet actually determined that the major aerosol constituent of the atmosphere is sulfuric acid.
Very different from water.
Very different. So now, instead of a lush tropical paradise, our picture of Venus is sort of a hellscape. It's so hot on the surface it melts lead and it rains.
No. Okay. So that was a cool finding from the Learjet. Now let's fly in my second example here.
Even the next airplane.
Yeah.
Move on up.
All right.
A new generation of airborne astronomy there. What's this one?
So this is a model of the Kuiper Airborne Observatory, which was the next generation after the Learjet.
Okay.
The Kuiper was a C-141 military cargo aircraft that was converted to house a telescope. Just like the Learjet, you can see that the telescope is in front of the wing right there, just behind the cabin. It's quite a bit larger than the Learjet was, right? So before the Learjet had a telescope that was only about 12 inches in diameter, so about 1 foot. This is about 36 inches, so 3 feet. It's about 3 times bigger. And the aircraft, of course, is quite a bit bigger as well. The Learjet had a passenger space for about 4 people with pilots.
Oh, really?
And then
That's
here
it.
we even have an upgrade, so you can have about 12 people on board. So it's still pretty small, but that's mostly because it's taken up, the fuselage is taken up with a lot of equipment and computers and whatnot. If this were just a passenger jet, it would be about 150 people or so on board, compared to the Learjet's, 6 to 12, something like that. Yeah.
And I think we have a picture of what it was like inside
here we
this
go.
plane. You mentioned not having a lot of space.
All right.
So here we go.
Yes, there it is. So you can see that most of the fuselage is taken up with computing equipment and control equipment. It looks kind of like something from an old missile silo or something.
And that's just inside our C-141. And what years did this fly for?
So it flew from about 1975 to about 1995, and it was very active during that time. So it conducted a lot of research. It flew for about 7.5 hours at a time, and it would fly 2 to 3 times a week. It made a lot of discoveries similar to the Learjet. It was one of the first observatories that observed the atmosphere of Pluto, for example.
Wow, Pluto.
Our
Pluto.
favorite, not a planet.
Yeah, Pluto, not a planet.
Hashtag Pluto, not a planet.
That's right. And we're actually lucky today to have one of astronomy's supervillains.
That's right.
Supervillain? What did you do?
It was the 2006 International Astronomical Union meeting where they decided to reclassify Pluto from a planet to a dwarf planet. And one of the main sort of contentions or things that people think wasn't quite right about it was towards the end of the meeting and there weren't a lot of astronomers left. There was only a few hundreds of us from the couple of thousand that were there for the whole meeting.
Okay.
But we had the vote and Pluto was determined not to be a planet. And I just want people to know that there was a majority opinion, a very large majority opinion of people who thought that Pluto should no longer be a planet.
Oh,
and for good
astronomers
reasons.
who
Astronomers,
agree.
yes,
Yes.
actual astronomers, yes.
It doesn't fit the mold.
It does not fit the mold of a major planet. That's correct.
It's okay to be a dwarf planet.
It's
That's
not
all
wrong
right.
with it. It's still a cool planet. It's still a cool place.
People talked about it getting demoted, but
Yeah,
it's
no.
okay.
Yeah. And what else did the Kuiper discover? Studied lots of things, you said.
Well, another one that people find very interesting is the discovery of rings around the planet Uranus.
Oh,
Was
really?
also done by Kuiper. So that's another popular one.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Those are some pretty big discoveries.
I know.
Yeah, they are.
That's exciting.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Awesome. Should we move on
Yes,
to our
let's move it on
third
up.
plane? This one's
Yes.
very exciting. This is no ordinary airborne observatory.
It is the biggest,
The world's largest.
largest, most
observatory.
modern.
And this is what you guys work on, right?
That's right.
That's right. So this is SOFIA. This is the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. And this is the mission that both Andrew and I work on. And so we're now looking at a 747 that's been heavily modified so that there is a much larger telescope in the back. So in the Learjet, we were talking about a 1-foot telescope in diameter. Kuiper was a 3-foot in diameter. Now we're talking almost 9 feet in diameter on this telescope here.
9 feet.
9 feet inside an
pretty huge.
airplane. That's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
And how often does this fly? This is, you said, the world's largest observatory.
Well,
airborne
largest observatory. It flies 3 to 4 times a week and 10 hours on a flight, so a little bit longer than the Kuiper, which was at 7.5 hours, and the Learjet only could fly for 3 hours. So we have a lot more observations coming out of SOFIA than we did those two facilities.
Yeah, and you'll notice that here the telescope is behind the wing, whereas in the other two models it was in front of the wing.
That's true.
It makes it much easier for the pilots to access the restrooms in flight, so that's a good thing. There's a lot more space to move around.
Okay, great.
So normally, if you're on a 747 passenger jet, it can house almost 300 people or so, and so there's a marked increase in size from the C-141 that was the Kuiper. And the telescope is in the rear, as I mentioned, and that hole, just to give you a sense of perspective, is about the size of a normal garage door, right? So that's how large a hole in the cavity.
And you said that's a hole.
That's a
Totally
hole. It's
open?
open to the atmosphere.
just
It's
open that
open
up.
to the atmosphere. It's not a window. And so if you look carefully at the fuselage, you might be able to make this out. There's a little rise leading up to the opening, and that rise was very carefully engineered and tested here at Ames, in our wind tunnels here at Ames, to take the air and direct it over the cavity and to have it redirect to the backside so that there's no turbulence in the cavity, or at least very little turbulence in the cavity.
No drag.
So it's very smooth airflow across that. The pilots assure us they can't tell if it's open or closed. It's almost seamless.
Oh, wow. And I think we have a video of this door opening, this
Yeah.
garage door in the back of the 747.
I want to see that, yeah.
So here's
flying.
SOFIA in all of its glory in flight, sunset trip. Yeah, and here's one of our test flights where we were opening the door for the first time. So you can see the door slowly opening in the back there, and eventually it'll open to about 10 feet in size because it's a 9-foot in diameter telescope. So.
And if you think that it looks like it's a little bit stubby for a 747, you're correct. It is. It's actually a 747 SP, so it's a special performance 747.
Okay.
They only made about 40 of those, but it's just a smaller, shorter version.
But we're on board. We're on board during these. It's not like they're being the telescope and the instruments are being remote worked.
Right.
We are on board the plane at the time. We are moving the people on board are moving the telescope. The people on board are using the instruments and collecting the data.
Oh,
It's a pretty
yeah.
active work environment.
Yeah. What is that like? Are you moving around? Are you fixed at your computer screens? What is it like on board?
Well, we have different stations where different people do their work. There's a station for the telescope operators who point the telescope to where we need it to go. There's a station for the instrument operators. These are the people who are looking at the data coming out of the cameras at the back end of the telescopes. There used to be eyepieces at the back of telescopes. Now everything's digital cameras or instruments that collect light and analyze light. And then you have mission directors who are talking between the scientists on the flight deck and the pilots up in the cockpit to already 7 people on board.
Right.
And the Learjet could only have 4 people on board besides the pilots.
I think we have a video on board SOFIA showing a little bit about the environment and what it's like.
Yeah, there's our second home.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, what you're seeing here is that's the back of the mission director's computers that I was talking about, the mission director's stadium. That's the science station there. That's where the people who are looking at the
Is that where you and Andrew sit?
That's where we would be. We were watching and analyzing the data come in on the astronomical instruments.
And if you're paying attention, people were facing the telescope, and so your back is to the direction that you're flying, right? You're facing
you're sitting
backwards.
So you're just saying opposite of what you would in a commercial airliner.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. And is that so everyone's facing the telescope?
We can watch and monitor what the telescope is doing.
Okay.
That's right.
Cool. I have an important question from Venom Plays 777. Are there in-flight meals?
There are not in-flight meals.
Oh,
There's no
no
catering except what you bring on board yourself.
Oh,
we
man.
do
Bring your
have
own.
we do have a galley which has microwave ovens. We have a coffee maker. We have refrigerators.
Now, for years we didn't, and there was a lot of celebration when we finally got a coffee maker.
Yes, and the microwave. That's great.
All right, BYO snacks.
Yes.
That's right. Bring your own snacks. 10 hours, so you need a lot of food.
Oh yeah,
That's right.
that is true.
I guess you get exactly what you want then.
Yeah, lunch is at midnight, so you have to taste things.
Okay, that's strange.
Because you're flying all night.
All night long, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
But I mean, we could actually observe infrared in the daytime as well, but we use optical cameras to find where we are in the sky, and so that's why we have to observe at night.
Makes sense.
I'm getting a lot of questions. How about we move on to
Yes.
our first segment, rapid fire questions. You
Rapid
ready?
fire, all right.
Ready?
All right, you asked for it, so here we go again. Rapid fire questions is where we cover as many questions from the chat as we can. So let's go. Quick questions, quick answers, and we'll hit as many as we can. There was a good question. Well, first of all, what's the observing cadence for Sophia from Cora Cretion? Is asking, is the Sophia telescope design more similar to a space telescope or a ground telescope?
Yeah, it's much more like a space-based telescope. We actually point and maintain our pointing through gyros, so just the way a space observatory works. And so, yeah, when you're in flight, there's turbulence, the telescope looks like it's bouncing around. It's not actually bouncing around, it's actually stabilized, inertially stabilized with respect to the stars. So that means it's not moving. Everything you're seeing is us bouncing around the telescope. So it's much more like a space-based telescope.
If you're not careful, it can give you a sense of seasickness just trying to watch it because it moves around a lot.
Yeah. I think we're going to see some of that later. That's pretty cool. Why use a plane? Are there advantages as opposed to common satellites? Could you review that a little bit for 8-Bit Pepper?
Right. So I mentioned easy access, which is a really big one. You know, if you launch a satellite and something goes wrong, either you're out of luck and it's just a lost mission, or it's a very expensive process to go about fixing it. Right? It takes a dedicated mission to fix it. Here we don't have that problem. Since we come home every night, we can address any issues that might arise. So that's one of the big advantages of being on board a plane as opposed to a satellite.
The other one is we can upgrade the technology. When you plan for a satellite mission, by the time you actually launch the mission, it's a couple decade old technology.
Right.
Since we come home every night, we can put the latest technology on board and try things out, and maybe even be a pathfinder for technologies that are used on future satellites.
Oh, yeah.
We've had a number of upgrades just over the last few years.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's
cool.
right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Bag of Spaghetti is commenting, that is pretty cool. And Fergus Digmus says, this is an incredible piece of engineering. It is, and just you wait. There's more to come. Why a bay door instead of a window from Resonator Games?
Yeah, so there's two reasons. One, since we're looking in the infrared, we are looking at heat, as we were talking about. We want the telescope as cool as possible. So at the higher altitudes that we're flying, we can get, minus 30 degrees Celsius, so it gets very, very cold. And we want our telescope to be cold because that gives us less background emission from the telescope. So that's one reason why we kind of want to open. It's sort of passively cooled by the atmosphere. But the other reason is there's very few materials that we can make a large window of this size out of that allows us to look at all of the wavelengths of infrared light that we're interested in looking at. Like I said, my glasses earlier are made out of material that block infrared light at the wavelength that camera. So our cameras look at a very broad range of wavelengths, and there just isn't material available in this size that would be
a garage door size sheet of diamond.
Of diamond. That would work.
Wait, that sounds heavy.
You don't have that?
And difficult to make.
All right. So many good ones. Are cosmic ray strikes an issue for Sophia data? Cora Cretion.
For much of our data, it's really not. And even for our optical cameras, where it is more of a problem, if you're taking a lot of images sequentially, then it's easy to remove cosmic ray hits. Okay. So most of the time, it's not an issue. Even for our optical cameras, we can deal with that if we need to.
Yeah, our detectors aren't as sensitive to cosmic ray hits, and because we co-add data, we take very short exposures and co-add them, it gets averaged out. Any cosmic rays get averaged out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's the distance that Sophia can see in terms of light years, basically, from David Espel?
Well, that's a tough one because it depends on how bright something is. So we did recently observe a quasar or something like that that was at
it was a lens galaxy.
That was at a very high Z. Z is 6 or something like that, maybe even more.
What's that
I don't
mean?
even remember. So what that means is it's very close to the dawn of the universe. So in terms of light years, again, it's all dependent on how bright the object is.
Okay, so it's more about brightness?
In that case,
more about brightness.
We were able to do it just because there was something in front of it that acted as a magnifying glass.
As a lens.
Okay.
And so that's why we were able to observe that.
Okay.
Interesting.
Maybe this is related. Solar Captain's asking, is Sophia going to be able to see further away than the observatory telescopes? I think ground-based observatories, I suppose.
Yeah, again, it all has to do with the brightness of the targets that you're looking at. Yeah, so we can see things very far away as long as they're bright.
And mostly that's a function of the size of the telescope. So the bigger you go, the easier it is to see faint objects, which may be farther away.
Right? Yeah, and most of the wavelengths that Sophia works at, we are now the largest observatory that there is. So there is the most light collecting power that we can get out of any facility is with our large telescopes.
Right, and there really is very little way to upgrade the size on an aircraft, right? Because the fuselage of a 747 is about as big as it gets. You can go a little bit larger, but it's not going to actually increase the size of your telescope very much.
We can't get a bigger telescope on board.
Yeah. You just can't squeeze in anything else.
All these upgrades from the early airborne observatories to now, the bigger plane was to get the bigger telescope.
That's right.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay. Maybe one more. Bunch of questions that are going to come up in the next section.
Yes.
So we're going to hold on to those. Let me see. Is the data recorded during these missions available to citizen astronomers from fourth and
That's a good question. So yeah, we do archive all of the data that we have. Most of our data is from people who have proposed to use our facility and have gone through a selection process. They have a proprietary year to look at it and do what they want with the data. But then after that, the data is public. You can go to our data website and download it. You just have to register your email, and that's it. So anybody could use it.
We do also have a number of what we call director's time programs, and those are data that we observe and then make it immediately available to the world. So anybody can look at that data right now. In fact, just a few days after it's been observed.
Oh, cool.
Cool. These are great questions.
Yeah, and there are lots more. But
we'll get to those later.
Yep.
So this is a reminder that you're watching NASA in Silicon Valley Live, and today we're talking about Sophia and airborne astronomy. Have questions? Put it in the chat, and we will get to them when we can, but we love your questions.
Yep. We're saying goodbye
to Jim and Andrew. Thank you for joining us. And now we will shortly have with us our guests, Kim and Ken, Kimberly Eniko and Ken Bowers. Welcome. Thank you both for joining us. Let you get settled here.
Yep.
Yes. So
all tucked in.
Yes.
All good.
Welcome, Kim and Ken.
The tongue twister.
Okay.
Yes. You could tell us a little bit about what you do here. Introduce yourselves.
My name is Ken Bauer, and I'm an engineer here at NASA Ames. And my job is easy to explain, but hard to do.
Okay.
I plan missions for SOFIA, the Airborne Observatory.
Very good.
And I'm Kimberly Eniko-Smith. I'm a research astrophysicist here at NASA Ames. And as an astrophysicist, I'm studying the phenomena of the universe. And I also do a lot of design and evaluate missions to study the universe.
Oh, okay. So a lot of people are using Sophia to do a lot of different science. Can you give us a little taste of what kinds of things you observe and study?
Absolutely. As Jim and Andrew were talking you through this amazing, the world's largest flying observatory, we have astronomers from all over the world applying for time to study the infrared universe. And a lot of their science is all about our origins. You know, how did we get here? Science about what are the conditions under which stars can form, the stellar nurseries. How do planets form? How do atoms, ions, molecules in the universe get into planetary systems? And we study a variety of objects from nearby, like comets and asteroids and planets in our own solar system, to star formation regions all over our own galaxy, the Milky Way. There are a variety of shapes and sizes.
It's amazing how many astronomers want to study dust.
Dust.
Dust. It's a very big thing.
Dust is where, you know, a large fraction of the light in the universe is irradiation with dust.
Wow.
We also study other galaxies outside of our own Milky Way, even some of these lens galaxies that Andrew had talked about.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about all these cool things that Sophia is looking at, but how you talked about planning these missions.
Yep.
So that goes into how we do that. Can you explain about that for us?
Sure. It starts more than a year before we fly a mission, and that's when we ask people, what do you want to look at? So scientists all over the world propose observations that they want to make. And then we take all of those, and there's about 5 times as many proposed observations as we could possibly observe. We put those in front of a panel of esteemed scientists, and they rank them for merit. And the list comes to me, and I only get the top 5th, and the names are taken off. And my job is to try to schedule all of those observations. Okay. It's a complicated jigsaw puzzle because the Earth goes around the sun, and you see different stars at different nights, and the Earth is spinning as well, so the stars are rising and setting. And if you look at the airplane, you'll notice the telescope is always on the left side of the airplane. So that means that if I want to look at a star in the north, I'm going to fly the plane to the east. If I want to eventually come home, which we'd like to do, so we can fly the next night, I need to find a star in the south to observe at the right time of the night. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle, and the pieces change every time you put one down.
Wow.
Because the Earth rotates and all the stars are now in a different location. We'll be tuning our flight plans from 10 weeks before we start flying, a particular clump of them.
Okay.
And we'll even be adjusting it the day of.
Wow.
Because most airplanes do care about wind, but not that much, because you just want to get someplace in an airplane.
Right.
So where the plane is going is fine. If there's a crosswind, you just lean into it a little bit, and you'll get there a moment later, and it doesn't really matter. We can't do that. We have to point the plane so that the telescope is always looking in the right direction. And if the wind needs to blow us, it's going to blow us.